Welcome to the broadcast. We began our consideration of the awful tragedy that took place yesterday with a conversation with the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joseph Biden.
When we strike, we not only strike ourselves. If we need, we will strike alone. But when we strike back, we will strike with the world behind us and literally with the possibility of other forces behind us. And so I think this doesn't mark an end of the way of life for Americans. I think this has the potential to mark the end of the way of life for organized terrorism in the world.
And from the Washington Post, columnist Jim Hoagland.
So you have to really cut those roots in Pakistan before you can really get cooperation. The question is whether the current ruler in Pakistan, General Musharraf, has complete control over the intelligence services. My best estimate is that he probably does today. We have the best chance we've ever had to get Pakistan to finally clean up the game.
We conclude with the perspective of three journalists who've been looking at the events of the last 2 days. They are Frank Rich, the columnist for the New York Times, Anthony Lewis, the columnist of the New York Times, and author David Halberstam.
We don't yet have a clear face on who the enemy is or what the point is, and I think that sows a certain kind of confusion and terror maybe beyond Pearl Harbor, not having lived through it. And it's another reason why the mayor's work has been so great in trying to stop any kind of witch hunt against certain ethnic groups or whatever until we know what the hell is going on.
We may be taking steps against civil liberties. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld suggested today that we need to do more to protect classified information. That's always the sort of knee-jerk reaction of people. More secrecy will save us, and to the contrary, it will hurt us, not save us.
So the idea that this is the beginning of a, to use John Kennedy's phrase, long twilight struggle of great patience, attention, high priority, that has got to be in there. This is not overnight, that you don't just do it with bombs. Even if you hit bombs, we have to understand in this world that we are creating people who might be the next generation's terrorists.
Day 2 of the attack on America when we continue.
Funding for Charlie Rose is made possible by Amazon.com, your online source for everything from books, music, and toys to videos, electronics, and tools.
Brought to you by the new Toyota Prius. Part gas, part electric. Nature should definitely approve.
Charlie Rose is also made possible by these funders.
And by Bloomberg, a provider of multimedia news and information services worldwide. From our studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
We're at the end of the second day after the devastating attack on the United States yesterday. Rescue workers continue to search for survivors. U.S. authorities are moving quickly to find who committed the act. They're pursuing leads in Massachusetts and Florida and Rhode Island. It was learned today and said today that the White House and Air Force One may have been targets in the attacks. President Bush spoke after a national security meeting this morning, declaring yesterday's events to be acts of war.
This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover. But it won't be able to run for cover forever. This is an enemy that tries to hide, but it won't be able to hide forever. This is an enemy that thinks its harbors are safe, but they won't be safe forever. This enemy attacked not just our people, but all freedom-loving people everywhere in the world. The United States of America will use all our resources to conquer this enemy. We will rally the world. We will be patient, we'll be focused, and we will be steadfast in our determination.
Tonight, as new facts become known and new questions arise, we continue our consideration of this national tragedy, a tragedy that has been marked by extraordinary acts of human drama and human courage and heroism. We consider the international dimensions and the congressional response with the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Democrat Joseph Biden of Delaware. Senator, thank you for coming.
Happy to be here, Charlie.
Tell me what you think the Congress might do in response to this tragedy.
Well, I think the first thing it's going to do, Charlie, is continue to fully support the president. He has incredible assets available to him to move against the perpetrators of these incredible acts of terrorism. We're narrowing down very clearly who the targets may be, but one of the things the president has done and Secretary Powell has done that I think has been masterful so far is, for the first time in our history, Charlie, NATO has voted that this is what we call in the jargon an Article 5 issue, which means that it is viewed as an attack against the entire alliance. And the one way to ultimately deal a blow to this kind of organized terrorism in the world is multilaterally and internationally with all parties involved. And I want to congratulate Secretary Powell and the President for getting this passed through NATO. They're working very closely with moderate Arab states, the Chinese and the Russians, to build a consensus that when we strike, we not only strike ourselves. If we need, we will strike alone. But when we strike back, we will strike with the world behind us and literally with the possibility of other forces behind us. And so I think this doesn't mark an end of the way of life for Americans. I think this has the potential to mark the end of the way of life for organized terrorism in the world.
Do I hear you saying that you believe that countries, in addition to NATO, like Russia, like China, like moderate Arab countries, like Egypt, like Jordan, are on board for a united strike against whoever might be identified as responsible for these attacks on America?
Let me be very precise. NATO is on board if it is shown, and I think we'll be able to show, that this was an attack from beyond our shores, that is organized by, it wasn't a domestic terrorist action, which I think we'll be able to show with some clarity relatively soon, number one. Number two, NATO forces then have signed on to participating with us in whatever action it takes to respond to this act of war. Number three, it is very important, if that does occur, that we have the minimum, the concurrence of and the support, if not in troops, the support of Putin in Russia and the Chinese, as well as the moderate Arab states, because then the message sent from that point on, Charlie, around the world is any nation who harbors these kind of networks and organizations not only has to face the West, but is a pariah in the rest of the world as well. That would be the single most significant step that will have ever occurred in dealing with network terrorism. We're never going to stop the guy who straps dynamite to his body and walks into a restaurant to implode himself, but we can stop this kind of network that is obviously sophisticated and obviously needed to practice, obviously has camps, obviously has undertaken this for a long time.
So this clearly means, as the President has suggested, that any country who harbors people who commit these kinds of acts should be held as responsible as the people who do the acts.
Absolutely. I remember being on your show a year and a half ago, Charlie, and we talked about sovereignty. And I remember you asking me at the time, did I think we had the right to just unilaterally react against a country that had harbored someone? And at that time, remember, there were attacks being taken place on Afghanistan. And I said to you at the time that I think the world has changed so that a nation forfeits its sovereignty when it harbors terrorists or treats terrorists with kindness and or cover. And I think that this is beginning to be, there's the possibility, it's not done yet. It's not done yet. And if it doesn't get done, we're not going to wait for multilateral response to this. We have many assets that we're fully capable of responding, and we will. But there is the potential to build, for the first time, Charlie, a consensus where you take this notion of international terrorism out of the geopolitical dynamic, where, for example, the Russians have to be thinking, does it make sense for me to continue to fund a program for long-range missiles in Iran? The Chinese have to begin to question their own judgment about their relationship with Pakistan and so on, because I can't believe that the Chinese leadership and the Russian leadership could not picture that aircraft flying into a building in Moscow or a large tower in Hong Kong, Shanghai, or Beijing. They understand that this is not something that is controllable, and they're viewing it more like nation states than they are like people playing dominoes or playing chess with what they view to be as their strategic opponents. There is a consensus growing here, and my hope and my expectation is that Secretary Powell will continue out of the geopolitical dynamic where, for example, the Russians have to be thinking, does it make sense for me to continue to fund a program for long-range missiles in Iran? The Chinese have to begin to question their own judgment about their relationship with Pakistan and so on, because I can't believe that the Chinese leadership and the Russian leadership could not picture that aircraft flying into a building in Moscow or a large tower in Hong Kong, Shanghai, or Beijing. They understand that this is not something that is controllable, and they're viewing it more like nation states than they are like people playing dominoes or playing chess with what they view to be as their strategic opponents. There is a consensus growing here, and my hope and my expectation is that Secretary Powell will continue to be able to pursue this at the United Nations as well as with the European Union to begin to build this kind of consensus. In the meantime, I want to make it clear, in the meantime, the President need not wait. The President need not take anything off the table in terms of response to the action that has been taken against us if he feels he is able to clearly and unambiguously act in a way that will produce a result. But I think there's a real opportunity here, Charlie. And again, I conclude my point where I began it, and that is people are talking about this changes the way of life for Americans. If we change our way of life, they've won. We should not change our way of life. I view this as the end, the beginning of the end of the ability of organized terrorist groups and large cells to be able to get the cover and succor of other nations and only be opposed by the West.
You think this is the start of a serious war against terrorism?
I believe it is, and God willing it will be. And again, I want to compliment Secretary Powell for what I consider to be an extraordinarily deft move in being able to get NATO to take on, for the first time in NATO's history, this is the first time it's ever been done.
How close, based on what you know, is the administration to having a provable case against an identifiable person, group of people responsible for these actions?
As you know, the detail that's classified, Charlie, but I don't think I'm violating any secrecy here by saying very close to being able to make an overwhelming case, a case that would meet the standard that NATO set up, which is if it is determined. It might not meet a legal standard beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law, but this is war. This is not a law enforcement undertaking.
That's an interesting point, because some people have criticized the terrorism effort before, saying that administrations in the past have considered it a law enforcement question rather than a question of war, and therefore with all the possibilities of state sponsorship.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true, but again, we have to make some very clear distinctions. Even in times of war, the civil liberties of Americans and the legal standard against Americans and or people in this country have to be met in order to take them to trial. But that does not mean that we cannot take action abroad relative to our own national interest and our safety. And because what's happened here, Charlie, is I think the analogy to Pearl Harbor is I don't think it's an appropriate analogy other than it was a dastardly deed that was done in a cowardly way. But the analogy that this is like a war is real, because the extent of the damage and the necessary sophistication and networking required, the dozens if not hundreds of people required to pull this off, could not have been done in the basement of some flat in some large city in Europe or the Mideast or anywhere else. So there has to be complicitous parties here who have known, and it's not sufficient. For example, some countries are going to have to make some very difficult decisions. All the countries expressing sympathy, and they all have to have made it, has to be very clear to them that they've got to choose sides now, particularly Pakistan. Pakistan has to decide. Pakistan has to decide. Where are they? Where are they? With whom do they stand? And the interesting thing about this is, Charlie, is the rest of the world is going to have to line up here. And the same thing's going to happen in the Middle East. Arafat has to understand if he thinks he can continue to engage in not bringing this kind of activity on a smaller scale to a halt, or at least attempting to, in the West Bank, he is sadly mistaken about where the sympathies of the West and the American people, and quite frankly, I think the world are. And so I think this is a god-awful way to present that, but we present it with the possibility of a larger resolution here. That does not in any way give solace. I know I've lost a wife, I've lost a child. I have some small notion of what it's like to get that phone call. I have some small notion of that. And so I know nothing that good that comes from this. Nothing, even if the best occurs and we really get our arms around the terrorist activities worldwide, will give any solace to any of the people who've lost loved ones here. But it is, my mom has an expression, out of every tragedy, something good may come if you look hard enough. This gives no solace to the people who have been injured. And right now, it probably Americans are listening to me saying, Biden, why aren't you just talking about the anger you feel? Well, I feel incredible anger about what's happened, but I also feel that this is an opportunity, if we do it correctly, and I like the way Powell's going about this, that we may very well do something very, very good.
Your assistants are saying to my colleagues that you have to go, because I got to get two questions in.
Sure.
Do you believe that Osama bin Laden and his associates are responsible for these attacks? Do you, Senator Biden, Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, believe Osama bin Laden and his colleagues, associates, are responsible?
Because I've accessed all the classified information, if I answer that either way, Charlie, it's going to be my violating. I mean, it's going to be presumed it's based on information I've been given. So I'm going to, I apologize.
Okay, well, let me ask the second question. Do you believe it's possible that someone could have carried these acts off with the precision of these 4 planes and perhaps more without having some relationship to the intelligence organizations of other states, like Iraq, like whoever you might choose?
I won't mention any country, but I think it's very unlikely, virtually impossible, for an action like this to have carried off without at least the tacit assistance of another country.
And by that you mean more than simply harboring them, but giving them information, helping train, whatever it might be.
I don't want to comment beyond that. Not now, Charlie. I apologize. I know it's frustrating, but I apologize for not commenting beyond that.
Final question. Do you expect there might be military action sooner rather than later because of the velocity of the investigation and the provable facts as to the identity of those responsible?
I think we may be in a position to move sooner than later, but I think if the coalition of the willing is pulling together as I hope it is, there may be a decision made, even if we could go earlier, to go slightly later in order to bring to bear more of not just our assets, but the world's assets against this organization.
Senator Biden, thank you. I know you had to wait because of some technical problems, and I thank you very much.
Don't apologize. I'm flattered you invited me on your show. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Senator Joseph Biden, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We'll be back in just a moment. Joining me now from Washington is Jim Hoagland of the Washington Post. His column on foreign policy is considered a must-read by many people in Washington and in this country as he looks at foreign policy issues and comments on them, as well as domestic policy issues, but his primary focus has always been international affairs. You just listened to Senator Biden there in the same studio. My sense of his remarks were that that they feel strongly that they know who did this and that there may be some association in some way with a state and some kind of state-sponsored terrorism and Osama bin Laden or some combination was at play here.
I think that's right. I think the senator made some good points. I thought his stress on Pakistan kind of tipped his hand on who he thinks is involved here and his direct appeal to Pakistan to come forward. I think probably complements an effort by the administration. I thought his stress on Pakistan kind of tipped his hand on who he thinks is involved here and his direct appeal to Pakistan to come forward. I think probably complements an effort by the administration. I would assume that by now or very shortly the administration has gone to the Taliban in Afghanistan and said, give up Osama bin Laden or else. And at the same time they go to Pakistan, which has a lot at stake here, and say, help us with the Taliban, help us get Osama bin Laden. Choose, as Senator Biden has said. I think by and large that is an approach that has a lot of value much more broadly as well. I think the same thing basically has to be said to the moderate Arab governments, and particularly to Saudi Arabia, which needs to come forward. Egypt needs to come forward to join in an effort to fight the kind of brutal terrorism that the United States has now been victim of, that people in the Middle East have long been victim of, and it's time to choose sides.
Explain why the focus on Pakistan, other than the fact that it is a neighbor of Afghanistan and there's always been traffic across that border.
The Pakistan intelligence services basically created the Taliban, with some help, I must say, from the United States during the struggle against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And the Taliban has, of course, played the major support role as the harbor safe haven for Osama bin Laden's terrorist group, which is the primary suspect in this. So Pakistan is deeply involved in what happens inside Afghanistan, has a lot of assets to bring to bear, and should now play a constructive rather than a destructive role.
What reason wouldn't they do that?
Well, they are so close, or at least let me rephrase that. The intelligence services of Pakistan are so closely entwined with the Taliban and with Osama bin Laden, with the gun smuggling, with the terrorist actions in Kashmir, that there's a nexus there. There's a kind of a shadowy world that thrives on terrorism. So you have to really cut those roots in Pakistan before you can really get cooperation. The question is whether the current ruler in Pakistan, General Musharraf, has complete control over the intelligence services. My best estimate is that he probably does today. We have the best chance we've ever had to get Pakistan to finally clean up the game.
So what would be the American government, and with now NATO backing and perhaps the backing of Russia, China, and moderate Arab states, what would be the message to the Taliban? You will deliver Osama bin Laden and his associates to us, or what?
Well, I think from the United States it's conceivable to make a direct military threat, that if they would like to see Kabul still standing, you will deliver him. From the other states, it is that we will support the American action, that this has gone too far. You have actually crossed a line this time that cannot be tolerated.
In the judgment of world opinion, we have the right to level Kabul if you don't give up the man that we have and his associate that we believe are responsible for this terrorist attack.
Yes, I use level Kabul as a figure of speech.
I understand.
But to take decisive military action against justified targets.
And you assume that the Taliban would do this now?
No. It's not at all clear to me that they would or would be able to find him now in the time frame, be able to organize themselves in the time frame that I think the President realistically thinks he has, which is not long, a week, 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's why it's a question sooner rather than later, because time is seemingly of the essence for this kind of action, because Osama bin Laden obviously is knows that they're coming.
I think that's right.
If he is they've got the facts and he's the guy, which we assume based on everything that comes out of Washington that I read and everybody I talk to.
I think he's certainly involved. It's the kind of operation that he and his associates, and that's a very loose term for these people, have practiced in the past. If you look at the bombing of the USS Cole in Aden last year and the 1998 bombings simultaneously almost of the embassies in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam, you see the ability to coordinate this kind of terrorist spectacular, and the fingerprints are there, I think, along with some other people as well.
Like?
You asked the question earlier about state sponsorship. The fact that there seem to have been at least 4 trained pilots who participated in this operation, probably more from what we can gather, suggest that perhaps they came out of some Arab Air Force, that they received help for training, certainly, and for coordination from secret services, from intelligence services that do this sort of thing for a living, that have the statecraft. I mean, it's not simply that you do the operation, it is that over a long period of time, they certainly have been preparing this for at least a year, you are able to keep that secret. That requires a high level of tradecraft, as it's called in the espionage business. A bunch of guys out in refugee camps or in the guerrilla camps in Afghanistan are not likely to have those kind of abilities and the resources it takes.
Or the discipline.
Or the discipline. That points to an Arab country, a sponsor, a supporter that has great burning reason to strike this kind of blow at the United States, and the top of that list happens to be Iraq, Saddam Hussein.
Do we know, are there intelligence reports that indicate some link other than motive between Saddam and Osama bin Laden?
There's nothing that I know of in this specific case. If you take the earlier effort in 1993 to blow up the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, there are links there between a couple of the chief operatives, one of whom, Ramza Youssef, traveled on an Iraqi passport and who constructed a very detailed legend or cover story about his identity that depended on the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. There are clear indications that the Iraqis gave some level of support. He then fled, by the way, to Baghdad. They gave some level of support to the earlier operation to destroy the same towers that they succeeded this time in destroying. So I think there's some patterns here that need to be explored, and I would say that one of the main things that has to come out of this is that the United States quit treating these incidents as isolated, unconnected incidents. There is now a pattern stretching over a decade of this kind of operation, bigger, smaller, but with clear fingerprints that you will find relationships have developed between these incidents.
It has been suggested to me by some people in conversation today that the Clinton administration did not want to pursue that connection.
I certainly saw no evidence that they did so in any forthright or aggressive manner. The chief objective for the last couple of years of the Clinton administration vis-a-vis Iraq was to keep Iraq off the front pages, really beginning in 1996 with the re-election campaign. There was no aggressive effort to establish connections that would have required an action, a major military action, that it seems to me that the people in the Clinton administration did not want to make.
Why?
It's risky. It is not easy. You compromise your chances for your domestic agenda. There are a lot of reasons not to do it. I don't say that this is going to be an easy thing, but I think at the same time you need to look at the facts clearly and to make the conclusions. I think that the key moment in how we approached Iraq and how we approach terrorism in the Middle East in general came during one of the periodic expulsions by Saddam Hussein of the UN inspectors who were looking for weapons of mass destruction. And the Secretary of Defense of the time went on television and held up a 5-pound bag of sugar and said, this could be anthrax. And a 5-pound bag of anthrax could destroy many American lives. Having signaled the danger, having pointed so specifically to the danger, the Clinton administration then realized there was nothing concrete, specific, and quick that they could do to calm the fears that they had just created. So they switched the subject. They stopped talking about it. And I think that was a terrible mistake.
Do you sense that this is a change, as Senator Biden suggested in the war against terrorism, that somehow this is going to be a signal moment, this attack, and that in the end, those who perpetrated it, for all the reasons you suggested in the column, which was in a sense to show and say to America, you are vulnerable for all your might and for all of your strength, economic and military, and for all of your notions of being a superpower, you are not invulnerable and you're not safe from those who have a dedicated mission.
I think it's important to look at that precisely, Charlie, because what we're talking about here is apparently, and we have to emphasize, we don't really know yet, but all of the indications that we have are that this is essentially about the Persian Gulf. What is Osama bin Laden's basic cause? It is to drive the United States out of Saudi Arabia. I think it's important to look at that precisely, Charlie, because what we're talking about here is apparently, and we have to emphasize, we don't really know yet, but all of the indications that we have are that this is essentially about the Persian Gulf. What is Osama bin Laden's basic cause? It is to drive the United States out of Saudi Arabia, to get American troops who are there because of Saddam Hussein and to help protect Saudi Arabia and Kuwait from Iraq. Osama bin Laden's objective is to get the troops out. So this is much more about the Persian Gulf than it is about the the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is at a very high pitch right now. So yes, I think the opportunity is there to change the way we look at things. I think Senator Biden was right to emphasize the importance of the NATO declaration. The United States for 50 years put troops and bases in Europe to show its determination to help protect Europe. Today, the Europeans voiced much more than good wishes toward the United States, but active support in a military sense now that we have become the target. This is the moment to turn, to really get the rest of the world to confront its responsibilities vis-a-vis terrorism and to take and to support our action.
Other than the battle against terrorism, does this change anything else in terms of the realm of their areas that you focus on as a columnist?
We don't know yet, but I think it very well could. I mean, this is, I think, one of those moments when history swings on its hinges, and if we take advantage of it to really focus on the need for a new national security strategy, then we are looking at significant changes in that part of American life. I think it's very important, of course, to continue to live as Americans, to live in a free society with all that that means. But I think Americans are, in this moment, prepared to put up with some inconveniences, with some changes in perhaps the way we look at military force, the way we use military force abroad, and what we're prepared to do to make that possible. I think it is a historic moment.
But to seize the moment, you have to do something that says you're not going to win this, and we are not going to allow, we being whoever is attacked, we're not going to allow you to change us because of the actions you take. I mean, the President spoke to that, and other people have spoken to that.
And yes? I can't put it any better than that. I think that's exactly right. I think you have to make it clear that we have finally understood this is a long-term struggle. We're not going to, simply by getting Osama bin Laden, simply by getting Afghanistan to close down those camps, if that happens, or perhaps we are required to close them down for them. Simply doing those things doesn't end this. This is a long 10-year, 20-year struggle that we have to commit ourselves to.
Do you sense that the Egyptians specifically are prepared to support this because of their own problems with terrorism?
I think they are, certainly their own history will incline them to do this, but it's not going to be easy. There are a lot of conflicting pressures here, and that is precisely why the question of American leadership, of making it very clear that there's no room not to join us, not to support us, and still be protected by the United States, still really to be a friend of the United States. I think that's why that's so important. They don't any longer have a choice of standing on the sidelines when it comes to America's war against the terrorists.
What's the danger and the risk for the administration as it considers all these actions?
When you move to significantly change the world's contours, as it were, the political contours, you're going to run big risk. We no longer have a choice of not doing that. We have to take the risk of Arab governments not being able to withstand the pressures that this will create. I think, by and large, in the Middle East in particular, once America strongly establishes its leadership position, as it did in 1990, 1991, and going into the Gulf War, and at the same time shows a determination to help bring about a lasting peace. Remember, the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, immediately convened the Madrid Peace Conference,
which led to Oslo.
Which led to Oslo, along with the Gulf War. You've got to do both those things. You've got to be very strong in doing them both and very clear.
And be very clear that as you do this, in a sense that you're willing to risk lives for the mission that you are articulating. At the same time, with the other hand, you want to let those know, those other, especially Middle Eastern countries, know that you are sensitive to what they have, that their own grievance.
That's right. Charlie, September 11th, 2001 demonstrated that we risk American lives and American interest by doing nothing also, by not doing what we should have been doing in the first place. We no longer have a choice of taking no risk. We take risk because we are the United States, because we are involved in the world, and I don't think any of us would want to walk away from that.
And not to lead is to encourage others to take advantage of you.
That's right.
Jim, thank you very much.
Charlie, thank you.
Jim Hoagland, columnist for the Washington Post. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Joining me now from Boston, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis. Also here, author David Halberstam and Frank Rich, who also writes a column for the New York Times. I'm pleased to have them here to give a kind of sense of how they feel and see and what has impressed them and what has questions they might have about the tragedy that began yesterday at 8:45 a.m. I'll start in Boston with Tony Lewis. Tony, when you look at this, tell me your feelings and impressions and sense of perspective on this tragedy.
Well, here on the second day, I still think the most important thing we need to do in the world is to gather what Secretary of State Powell put very well, a worldwide coalition, a worldwide effort to build a coalition against terrorism. It's terribly important for us not to be alone, but to make this an international effort. I thought Powell put it really wonderfully in a way that the President has not. Then the other thing that is worrying is the sense that we may be taking steps against civil liberties. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld suggested today that we need to do more to protect classified information. That's always the sort of knee-jerk reaction of people. More secrecy will save us, and to the contrary, it will hurt us, not save us.
Frank?
Well, I share Tony's view, obviously, that we have to try to build a coalition, and his hope that the Secretary of State is doing that. It's certainly the news, such as it is, coming out of Washington, suggests that is what is going on, and the President, however inarticulately, is trying to say, let's be patient and let it happen. Another thing that has impressed me over the past 2 days is New York City. I mean, just the resilience of many people in the city in the face of an incredible tragedy, starting with the mayor of New York, I might add, who I feel has done an extraordinary job over the past 2 days in a way that I wish the President had for the country.
I'm struck by that too, David, aren't you?
The
Mayor Giuliani has clearly been.
And I think in a number of ways, I think, for instance, I mean, the humanity, I mean, obviously very affected by it, but I think in also trying to tamper down any easy jingoism on locale towards Arab groups or anything. It's, when he's good, he's really good. When he's bad, he's really, I thought it was wonderful. The sense of the city, you know, it's a new era. This is, Tony and I are both old enough to remember Pearl Harbor, and this is sort of, I think the idea that there is parallels with Pearl Harbor are really right. I think this is New chapter. It is a declaration of war when you take 3 planes and turn them into missiles. I mean, a terrorist group that has no air power, no air force, suddenly had an air force. And as such, what is at stake, it seems to me, is the very concept of the open society which we are. So much freedom. If you've worked in totalitarian countries like I am, you go to check into a hotel or get on a plane, and you have to bring about 20 documents to prove that we are so quick and impatient and democratic, and so much is at stake that we have this easy access, and that is being challenged by a very, very small handful of people. And, you know, we need to be both strong and hold on, if we can, to those freedoms. It's going to be a real challenge.
Richard Holbrooke made this point last night on this program, that this is really...
You had Holbrooke on before us. We're all out of here. We're all.
How could that possibly happen?
Because we were talking about the coalition building. Here is the notion, is that this really is a security issue. I mean, the coalition building is obvious. NATO had some actions about that today. Nationals, they would consider a declaration against everybody, membership of NATO. But it is a security issue. Tony makes the point about the threshold of civil liberties, but I assume that we will see considerably more security at airports as a result.
And everywhere. We're also used to...
Not just airports.
I mean, today we were told not to mail letters in mailboxes in New York City, just to go to post offices. Another thing, though, that I want to bring up in relation to what David said, for all the similarities to Pearl Harbor, there's one spectacular difference sort of at the ground level of the citizen, which is we don't yet have a clear face on who the enemy is or what the point is. And I think that sows a certain kind of confusion and terror, maybe beyond Pearl Harbor, not having lived through it. And it's another reason why the mayor's work has been so great in trying to stop any kind of witch hunt against certain ethnic groups or whatever until we know what the hell is going on.
Again, Charlie, if I may, again, that's where you should be looking. I think we should be looking for leadership from President Bush. It's very important to tell the country that we need not be, we should not be hysterical, we shouldn't pick on any group. Giuliani was wonderful. I saw him on television today, and I just thought that was terrific, and I look for that from the national leadership. We haven't had it yet.
I think it's, by the way, much more than a security issue. I think it's really about the very nature of the society. I think that we have been on a binge in this society of sort of self-absorption. We are a monopoly superpower. We're the most powerful nation in the world, but if you look at our most powerful media, it's, I think, effectively isolation, as it's been cutting down on foreign correspondence. The most highly rewarded people in your world of television are people who do trivial celebrity reporting, as if we can be this great power with extraordinary influence and not pay attention to the rest of the world. And I think it's a very serious judgment out there. I mean, not that if we had had more foreign coverage or paid more attention, this might not have happened, but we would be a smarter, wiser, much better focused country as to what the world is like,
well,
why
David,
there are.
But David, we turned off the rest of the world after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yes, that's
communism
that's
was
very
dead.
Specifically what I'm talking about, that after the Soviet Union, as if, well, the oceans, the ponds, the oceans which became ponds are oceans again, and we don't need to think about it. We're safe.
Nothing to worry about.
And
this, in fact, shows clearly our vulnerability.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a much more, it's a different kind of danger. It's a very complicated one. It's sometimes more insidious, but it's a very real world. And the fact that you are rich and powerful does not make a lot of people in the world like you. It makes you a target.
Charlie,
yes,
you used a word a little while ago that I think is important in a way beyond the way it's been used, patience. Americans are extremely impatient people. You go to other countries, you realize how much more people are reflective, prepared to wait, think, consider. We rush onto planes. We're going to have to change that. There's not going to be any rushing onto planes. There's going to be much less rushing in general. And we're going to have to be, whether we like it or not, we're just going to have to be more patient.
But that's going to take leadership to achieve, because we are in this society right now, and a lot of it's driven by the media, where we always want instant results. We always, you know, there's shark attacks, and we're going to deal with it in 10 minutes and then go on to the next thing.
But do you think part of this is because of the intensity of coverage of an event like this, or even the shark attacks? I mean, all weekend when you had the shark attacks.
We don't differentiate between shark attacks.
May I suggest that Connie Chung's big super interview with Condit doesn't seem quite as important and as quite an important media event. The Lewinsky story. I mean, so many things that starting in the cable world, but feeding into the prime time of primetime magazines and news shows. I mean, this binge of celebrity stuff, that comes from somewhere. If you do that, you're not doing something else. And we've been on a very trivial agenda, and you have to reorient yourself to what matters.
Okay, but David, let me ask this. I mean, all of us here and in Boston love, international affairs and the study of and the whole geopolitical considerations. But let's assume we had lots of reporting. What difference would it have made in terms of the desire by someone to lash out against the United States?
No, it doesn't change that. The ability to lash out. It gives you a longer attention span, a better sense of what the world is, of how to put your resources. It upgrades the people in government who pay attention to this as opposed to downgrading them, which is what we've been doing.
I want to talk a moment, Tony, about, you raised it a couple of times, presidential leadership. I mean, it was, in fact, after Oklahoma City that I think President Clinton gained some footing in terms of the way he handled that. What's the challenge for President Bush?
The challenge,
Tony first, come back.
I think the challenge fundamentally is for people to look to him as a wise, stable guide in this very difficult situation. And I have to say, I'm not a fan of George W. Bush. I wouldn't criticize him in this situation, not at all. But I think I could say carefully that nothing he has said so far gave anybody the feeling of unifying power and support of yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Now, everybody who heard that was ready to rush out to the barricades and fight for this country. Now, there's been nothing like that. And I don't know whether he's capable of it.
And he doesn't have to go to Clintonian excess, but 4 minutes, frankly, is not enough for an address to the nation. And it was so heavily scripted. And the one time he spoke unscripted yesterday, it was sort of a disaster when he was still, I guess, the school in Florida, and said, the folks who did this act. Well, that's just not the right locution under the circumstances. And hence they heavily scripted him at night. But we've got to believe that he's one of us and can take charge.
That he understands the moment and can articulate what it is, the common feeling of the public.
Was diametrically different on the ideological scale as someone like me, but on the moment of the challenge or disaster, he was just marvelous. I think a president should be able to, if possible, articulate the strengths, resiliency, wisdom, and inner confidence of the people. I mean, this probably comes from the Middle East. It's a very difficult equation compared to even World War II in Japan. I mean, as Churchill said on December 8th, the deed was done, Japan would be crushed by powder, because he understood the industrial equation. Now we have an equation where the closer you get to the heart of the Middle East, the weaker the magnetic field of power of intelligence is. And even if you quote, and we want to put a poster on it, bin Laden, I presume that's what everybody's talking. If you put the bin Laden poster and you took him out within some fortunate thing, that doesn't change you. I mean, it's going to keep coming. So the idea that this is the beginning of to use John Kennedy's phrase, long twilight struggle of great patience, attention, high priority, that has got to be in there. This is not overnight, that you don't just do it with bombs. Even if you hit bombs, we have to understand in this world that we are creating people who might be the next generation's terrorists. It is a very tough, long struggle.
But if I hear you, and this has been said earlier, just to underline it, that this is a time in which you hope that comes out of this is a sense that terrorism is the enemy of us all, and that therefore there will be more resolve to do something about it in a united effort involving all countries of a like mind.
Yes, and we're passing too rapidly, Charlie, we're passing too rapidly by the word, passing by the word intelligence. It's a little too easy to attack the CIA and say they should have known, because it's very difficult to know for the reason that David said. The Middle East is just rather impenetrable. But we still did a rotten job. And today's Financial Times had a story saying, with a former CIA official saying, the CIA has, bugger all people who can speak Arabic, who can penetrate Middle Eastern society. They just haven't done the job. And we're spending tens of billions of dollars on intelligence, and what are we getting for it? It's very hard to focus on that, to make it accountable. It's hard for the public, it's hard for Congress, but it absolutely has to be done.
And since these threats, at least in the general sense, particularly from this possible perpetrator, are hardly unknown, it raises questions about what this administration has been doing over the course of these months when it's been so preoccupied with this missile shield and this Defense Department reevaluation. Has anyone been looking at the intelligence services? Has this even been on their radar screen? We don't know that.
Well, one of the problems
I assume
is
it was.
One of the problems is that we're so good at high technology that we have tended to sort of believe that we can do it all through high technology, and we sort of moved away from some of the other forms of intelligence, I believe. And an extension of that is the missile shield. It's really, this is not a time, not a place to get too partisan. It's really, I mean, we are all in this together, but you know, the interesting thing about the missile shield is it protects us against countries that aren't really a threat to us, and the people who are a threat to us can clearly, I mean, clearly for years the great threat to us is in effect some guy coming in with a cardboard suitcase and an atomic weapon and leaving it in Grand Central. That's the real threat. The extension of that is the missile shield. It's really, this is not a time, not a place to get too partisan. It's really, I mean, we are all in this together, but you know, the interesting thing about the missile shield is it protects us against countries that aren't really a threat to us, and the people who are a threat to us can clearly, I mean, clearly for years the great threat to us is in effect some guy coming in with a cardboard suitcase and an atomic weapon and leaving it in Grand Central. That's the real threat. And the missile shield doesn't protect us. It's a high technology Maginot Line. It doesn't protect us from what happened yesterday. It doesn't really protect us from much of what we're really vulnerable to in the future.
Let me just touch on this also.
But it's an instinct, given what our strengths are, to go to our strengths. You know, the guy who loses the dollar bill and he goes and looks where the light is, and they say, was that where you lost, that part of the room where you lost it? No, but the light's better there. It's what we do better.
Right, right. Let me turn to the human emotion of this. I have read today, have met people in the street who have come up to me and told me one powerful story of human emotion and human drama and human connection after another. You know, people who got down and all the people who rushed in to give blood. You know, the heroic stories of firemen and policemen here in this city where, and I'm sure the same thing was true around the Pentagon after that. Tell me about the human drama that you have felt and witnessed over the last 24 hours.
I'll give you one example. There's a young man who works at the New York Times who told me the story today about being in the process of walking from the East Village where he lives to the West Village to vote yesterday morning as all this happened, and seeing what was happening and finding he didn't want to run away. He wanted to run toward the event to be of help if he possibly could, which he then did until it became impossible. And the whole feeling of this city, the whole tone, you know, there hasn't been any looting, there hasn't been any horrible behavior. It seems to me it's almost all been humane and often heroic behavior.
Tony, I'm about to lose you by satellite, so.
Oh, I simply will say, listening to this and the stories I've heard, doesn't it make all the things we usually worry about look trivial? This thing is so big, and I don't just mean the terrorism, but the human response that you're talking about, Charlie. Yeah. I've heard the same thing, and it's really wonderful.
And that is also...
And the firemen going into that building as everyone else was fleeing. I mean, if you take no other image about human strength and courage and nobility, which is a great strength of ordinary people. I mean, we're not talking high-profile people. Going into that doomed building as everybody else was rushing out. I mean, I think that if you forget everything else in terms of that is just a great strength.
And the thousands of, I mean, not thousands, but I've certainly heard a share of stories about people using technology, knowing that the end was soon, and calling up wives and loved ones for a message just to connect before certain death.
I began my column with that story today. It absolutely brought tears to my eyes. A man who called his wife to say goodbye, and I think it happened with a number of people.
We have a young friend named William Roberts, who's son of friends of ours, who was about 14 years old and worked this summer at Bellevue. And on his own, he went up to Bellevue to help out yesterday. I mean, 14 years old.
Yeah, incredible stories like that. Tony, I have to say goodbye to you because I'm going to lose the satellite.
Goodbye, Frank. Goodbye, David.
Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it very much. So what in the end will be different now, you think? I mean, will this have a lasting mark, or other than the scar it leaves in terms of the physical place, which can be changed again and again? I mean, architects can build other buildings. What will be the scar on the psyche of this city, positive or negative?
It's an enormous scar. First of all, we're of a certain generation or generations. We don't even know what the scar is going to be on our children, the younger generation, and they're going to live with it a lot longer than we are. And some of them I know that kids I've talked to feel it's their Kennedy assassination, but isn't quite like the Kennedy assassination. It has its own dynamic that's totally different, including the fact that you see these images over and over again on television, these nightmarish images. And I think it's the end of an era. I think David's exactly right. We have come through this 10-year binge of sort of frivolity and a bubble and everything else.
And invincibility.
And this is it.
Well, I think it's the end of one era. I mean, Americans have been very fortunate in this century. In the last 50 years, I mean, no bombs fell on us. Oklahoma was really, oddly enough, us bombing us. And we've got a couple generations that feel invulnerable, and we're not invulnerable. Nobody's invulnerable in this world which has shrunk so much. There are no immunities, and that's something that we all have to now start living with. And what's a reminder is that it's still a dangerous world, that you better pay attention, that you better try and understand what is around you. And even when you do it all and do everything right, it's still dangerous.
Thank you very much, David Halberstam and Frank Rich. This has been a remarkable second day in which we have heard thousands and thousands and read thousands and thousands of stories, as we say, about individual heroism, about people thinking first of others rather than themselves, about, in this city, a mayor who has shown a unique capacity in this particular circumstance to lead and to somehow give voice and expression to the common feeling which leadership demands, I think, in times of crisis. Someone who somehow, by the choice of words, horrific it may be, or the fact that the deaths may be too much to imagine, those kinds of expressions unite us all and give us a sense of how precious life is, and how each day is one to be treasured because of the dangers there, and that when those dangers come, it calls on another element of the human spirit, which is to unite and help others. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.